The sun in the Arizona Territory, late in the 1870s, was not a source of life. It was a judgment. It hammered the basalt plateau, bleaching the color from the sky and cracking the earth into a map of profound thirst. It drove every sane creature underground, leaving the high desert to the mad, the desperate, and Eli Mercer. Eli was all three. He put one cracked boot in front of the other, a shuffling, agonizing rhythm. His mouth was full of dust, his tongue a dry rasp against the roof of his mouth. He unhooked his canteen. The tin was almost too hot to hold. He shook it, listening to the faint, pathetic slosh. Enough for three careful sips. He unscrewed the cap, his fingers stiff. He tipped the canteen, letting the first sip, thick with alkali, slide into his mouth. He held it, letting the moisture soak in before he forced the swallow. It burned all the way down. He capped the canteen. 2 sips left. He figured he was 12, maybe 15 miles from his shack on Red Willow Wash. Miles that might as well have been the moon. The heat shimmered off the rocks, making the distant mesas dance. His vision blurred at the edges, the world reduced to a pulsing, brown glare. He cursed the sun, a voiceless crackle in his throat. He cursed the railroad, which had laid its iron tracks straight through the promises of prosperity, bypassing his small patch of earth for the wider valleys. And he cursed the man who owned those valleys, Judah Pike. The name was a mouthful of ash. The cattle baron who saw the territory as his personal ledger. A man who believed that if he could not buy something, he had the right to burn it. Eli had not eaten in 2 days. The hunger was a cold, tight knot beneath his ribs. He was checking his old trap lines near a dry arroyo, a deep scar in the earth where water had once ripped through. He held no real hope. The lines had been empty for a month. But hope was not required for motion. Stubbornness was. He was looking for a jackrabbit, maybe even a lean coyote, anything to quiet the gnawing void. That is when he saw the buzzards. They were not circling high, riding the thermals in lazy appraisal. They were low, impatient, hopping from one dead branch to another, their ugly red heads cocked toward the ground. Something was down. Something was dying. Eli's first thought was a calf, maybe strayed from a distant herd, meat, but as he got closer, his eyes, squinting against the glare, caught something else, a flicker of color. Not the brown of deer hide or the gray of rabbit fur. It was blue, with a thread of red, a scrap of patterned cloth, snagged on the thorns of a mesquite branch near the lip of the wash. His breath hitched. That was not animal. He slid down the loose scree of the arroyo wall, his boots sending a cascade of pebbles rattling into the silence. The air in the wash was still, hotter than the plateau above, trapped. And there, half buried in the sun-baked sand where the last flash flood had receded, was the source. It was a boy, an Apache boy. Eli froze. He had seen Apaches before, mostly at a distance, spectral figures moving through the high country, or as rumors of ghosts in the saloons. This one was close, too close. The boy looked to be about 13, maybe 14 summers, though it was hard to tell. He was thin, dressed in hide leggings and the remnants of that patterned shirt. He had been thrown, or had fallen, from the rimrock above. His leg was twisted at an angle that made Eli's own bones ache, the dark copper skin torn open by a long, shallow rifle graze that had festered in the heat. Flies crawled on the wound. He was not dead. Not yet. Eli took a step closer, his shadow falling across the boy's face. The boy's lips were black and split open, caked with dried blood and dirt. His eyes were open but saw nothing, the pupils unfocused, rolling back to the white. He was whispering, a low, desperate string of sounds in a language Eli could not understand. He was drowning in the heat. Eli stood over him, a tall, gaunt specter in a sweat-stained hat. The arithmetic of the desert was simple and brutal. There was the boy. There was the canteen. 2 sips of water. 2 sips were not enough for 2 people. They were barely enough for one. He weighed his options with the ruthless honesty that only true desolation can teach. If he gave the water to this boy, this stranger, this Apache, He would not make it back to Red Willow Wash. The sun would have him before he crossed the halfway mark. He would end up just like this, staring blind at the sky while the buzzards waited. If he walked away, no one would ever know. The desert kept its secrets. He could turn around, climb out of the arroyo, and pretend he had only seen a dead coyote. He could save himself. He almost did. His boot shifted in the sand, ready to turn. Then, a memory sliced into his brain. Sharp as a shard of glass, his father, a man with hands like cured leather, sitting by a fire back in Texas. So many years ago. The smell of wood smoke and coffee, his father's voice. Low and steady. A man ain't what he says he is. Eli, he ain't even what he thinks he is. A man is the sum of what he does when nobody is watching. Nobody was watching. Another memory followed. This one acidic and fresh. The night Judah Pike's hired guns rode down on his small ranch. The smell of kerosene, the popping roar of dry timber catching fire. His small herd, the one he had built from nothing, scattered and shot, their bodies left to rot in the canyon. He remembered the laughter of the riders as they lit the torch that consumed his barn. Pike had offered to buy his water rights for pennies on the dollar. Eli had refused. And for that, Pike had burned his world, leaving him broke, bitter, and walking. He looked down at the boy. Another life about to be erased by circumstance. The boy made a sound. It was not a plea. It was too late for that. It was a tiny, broken exhalation. Half whimper, half breath. The last guttering of a flame. Eli's hands moved before his mind did. He cursed. A short, sharp sound. He ripped the canteen from his belt. His hands were shaking, not from weakness, but from the magnitude of the choice. He fumbled with the cap, dropped it in the sand, and did not bother to pick it up. He knelt, sliding one arm under the boy's shoulders to lift his head from the sand. The boy weighed nothing. Eli tilted the canteen. He did not pour. He dribbled. A few precious drops onto those cracked lips. Nothing. "Come on, damn you," Eli whispered. "Drink." He tried again. A tiny stream of water found the crease of the boy's mouth and disappeared. The boy's throat worked. A desperate, reflexive swallow. His eyes flickered. A brief spark of consciousness in the haze. He swallowed again. Eli gave him the rest of the first sip. Then the second. All of it. He watched the water vanish into the boy, a sacrifice disappearing into the sand. The canteen was empty. Eli sat back on his heels, the finality of the act settling on him like a shroud. He was a dead man. Well, at least he would die doing something that was not just for himself. He looked at the boy's leg. The wound was bad, black at the edges. He took the hem of his own threadbare cotton shirt, the one thing protecting his back from the sun, and tore a long strip from it. Then another. He bound the wound tightly, wincing as the boy's body arched in a silent scream of pain. "Easy," Eli grunted. Though the word was for himself, he could not leave him here. The act was incomplete, with a groan that seemed to tear from his very marrow. Eli stood. He bent, worked his arms under the boy, and hoisted him over his shoulders in a fireman's carry. The boy's unconscious weight drove Eli's knees deep into the sand. He began to climb out of the arroyo. The trek back to Red Willow Wash was not a walk. It was a descent into hell. His legs, already weak from hunger, trembled with every step. The boy's weight was a boulder, crushing the air from his lungs. The sun, now in the afternoon, was at its most vicious. His vision tunneled. The world shrank to the few feet of cracked earth in front of his boots. He measured his progress not in miles, but in yards. From one saguaro skeleton to the next, from one flat rock to the next. He stopped counting the times he fell. He only counted the times he got back up. Each time was harder. The sand grated against his raw palms. He lost his hat. The sun beat directly on his skull, and the world began to tilt. Every step was a quiet curse at Judah Pike. Every breath was a stubborn prayer to a God he was not sure he believed in. He was running on nothing but spite and the memory of his father's voice. He did not remember the last mile. He simply found himself there, stumbling against the crooked doorframe of his shack. It was hardly a structure. It was a lean-to built of sun-cracked boards and discarded railroad ties, with shingles missing from the roof like rotted teeth. It was a monument to his failure. He shouldered the door open and staggered inside. The air in the shack was stifling, thick with the smell of dust and old sweat, but it was shade. He crossed the single room in 2 strides and gently, almost reverently, laid the Apache boy on his only bunk, a rickety frame laced with rawhide strips. There was a bucket in the corner. He looked into it. A film of water, maybe half an inch deep, remained at the bottom, scummed over with dust. It was his water for the night. He picked it up, dipped the corner of his neckerchief into it, and used the last splash to gently clean the wound on the boy's leg. The boy flinched, but did not wake. That done, Eli's legs finally gave out. He slid down the warped plank wall, his back scraping against the wood, and collapsed onto the dirt floor. The empty canteen, still hanging from his belt, thudded against his chest. It sounded like a verdict. The heat of the day gave way to the bruised purple dusk of the desert night. The temperature dropped 20 degrees, but Eli felt nothing. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his thirst a living thing, a fire in his throat. In his waking moments, he heard the boy. The fever was on him. He was murmuring, tossing his head on the bunk. Names, places, fragments of a life Eli would never know. And one word, repeated over and over. A soft, pleading sound. A word that sounded to Eli like grandfather. Eli closed his eyes, surrendering to the crushing exhaustion. He did not know what he had done. He did not know that the boy was Toba, the grandson of a great chief. He did not know that mercy, given in the dark when nobody was watching, was a seed. And he did not know it was about to bring an army to his door at dawn. It was not a sound that woke him. It was a feeling. Eli came up from the black, thirsty pit of unconsciousness, feeling the floorboards vibrate against his spine. Before sunrise, the air was cold, a thin, sharp chill that did nothing to soothe his parched throat. His first coherent thought was of water. His second was that the earth was moving. He lay still, his eyes cracked open in the gray gloom of the shack, listening. A low, distant rumble. It felt like it was coming from inside his own head, the pulse of his profound dehydration, or perhaps thunder, the impossible promise of a storm. But the sound was too even. It was not the organic roll and crackle of weather. It was a rhythm. It was the pounding, metronomic beat of countless hooves, rolling across the hardpan. The vibration intensified. A cup of water, had he possessed one, would have shown ripples on its surface. The sound was not just heard, it was felt in his teeth, in his bones. It was the sound of weight, of mass, of intention, and it was coming closer. Every muscle in his body screamed as he pushed himself up from the floor. His limbs were water, his head a hot, aching stone. He grabbed the doorframe to steady himself, his knuckles white. The wood itself seemed to hum with the approaching force. He stumbled out onto the warped planks of the porch, and he froze. The world was still in that flat, shadowless light of pre-dawn. The horizon, which should have been a sharp, dark line against the pale sky, was gone. In its place was a moving wall, a churning, rolling cloud of dust that stretched from the northern mesas to the southern ridge, a mile wide and rising like a tidal wave. It was not a storm, it was an army. As he watched, his mouth hanging open, the first figures began to emerge from the brown haze, resolving themselves into shapes. Horses, men. They were not a disorganized rabble. They rode in disciplined lines, fanning out as they approached, a great silent crescent opening its arms to swallow his tiny, pathetic shack. The ground was shaking now, a low, continuous earthquake, as if a storm of horses had indeed consumed the desert. Eli's mind, numb with thirst and exhaustion, struggled to comprehend the scale. He tried to count, 10, 50, 100. The lines kept coming, filling the landscape, more and more riders materializing from the dust their own passage had created. He stopped trying to count. He knew, with a sudden, cold certainty, that there were hundreds of them, maybe 300. They were Apache. They carried lances that bristled against the sky. Bows were slung over their shoulders, quivers full. He saw the dull gleam of rifle barrels resting in the crooks of their arms. Their shields, held low, were painted with symbols he did not understand, circles, lightning bolts, animal figures. Their faces were set, unreadable, their eyes fixed on him. 300 warriors, 300 armed men, encircling a shack that could not keep out a good wind, much less an angry nation. The tide of riders slowed, then parted. From the center of the mass, a single horse stepped forward. It was a magnificent white stallion, its breath pluming in the cool air. The man who sat astride it was broad-shouldered, his posture radiating an authority that needed no announcement. A feathered headdress, sparse and elegant, stirred in the dawn breeze. This was a leader. This was Chief Nantan. Beside him, on a restless bay mare, rode a younger woman. She wore hide leggings and a simple tunic, her dark hair pulled back in 2 severe braids. She was coiled, her entire being focused forward. But it was her eyes that held Eli. They were sharp, analytical, and moved over the scene with a quick, assessing gaze. Eli's right hand twitched. It dropped to his hip, his fingers curling to find the worn grip of his Colt. The holster was empty. The gun had been sold in Tucson 2 months ago for a bag of flour and $3. He stood barehanded in the doorway of his collapsing home. His shirt was torn, stained with his own sweat and the boy's blood. His cheeks were hollow, his beard matted with dust. He looked every inch the broke, starving cowboy he was. And he was facing an army, with the fluid precision of a single organism. The 300 riders halted. The pounding rhythm of the hooves ceased, cut off as if by a signal Eli had not seen. The silence that fell was immense. It was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. The world held its breath. The silence was broken by the smallest sounds, the snort of a horse, the jingle of a bridle, the scrape of a boot in a stirrup, a single, dry cough from somewhere in the ranks. Then, nothing but the high, thin whistle of the desert wind moving through the cracks in his wall and the frantic, hammering pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears. Chief Nantan swung his leg over the white stallion and dismounted. He did not move like an old man. His movements were deliberate, economical, and filled with grace. He landed softly on the hardpan. He stood for a long moment, simply studying Eli. His gaze was methodical. It started at Eli's ruined boots, caked with the sand of the arroyo. It traveled up his legs, lingering on the empty, sagging gun belt, then moved to his torn shirt, and finally, to his face. Nantan's expression was stone. Then, the chief's eyes shifted, glancing past Eli's shoulder, into the dark interior of the shack. He was looking at the bunk. He was looking for the boy. The woman, Raya, slipped from her horse. She did not dismount. She flowed. She landed in a low crouch, like a drawn bow, coiled and ready. Her gaze was not slow and methodical like the chief's. It was a rapid, flickering assessment. Her eyes snapped to Eli's face, searching for guilt or fear. Then they darted to the empty canteen that still hung from Eli's belt, swinging slightly. Her eyes narrowed. They moved into the shack, finding the bunk, and fixed on the bloody, makeshift bandage wrapped around the boy's leg. She said something, a short, sharp burst of Apache. It was a question, or a challenge. Her eyes never left Eli's face. She was waiting for him to move, daring him to. Eli looked from the 300 silent, armed warriors staring at him from the rising sun. He looked at the coiled woman and the stone-faced chief. Then his gaze drifted back into the gloom of his shack, to the small, weak form shifting in fevered sleep on his bunk. He felt the true weight of what he had done. He had spent his last measure of strength and his last 2 sips of water on an act of simple, stupid mercy. And now, 300 armed questions were standing in his yard. Chief Nantan moved. He did not ask for permission, nor did he wait for an invitation. He simply walked forward, his presence so immense that it seemed to suck the air from the porch. Eli, parched, unarmed, and swaying on his feet. was forced to make a choice: stand his ground as a barrier or step aside. He pressed his back against the rough, splintered wood of the door frame, moving aside. He felt a sudden, sharp, and utterly foolish surge of protectiveness for the boy on the bunk, which was immediately crushed by the overwhelming realization of his own powerlessness. Nantan was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and he had to duck his head to enter the gloom of the shack. The feathers of his headdress brushed against the crooked door frame. The instant he was inside, the small, stifling room seemed to shrink, the air becoming thin and tight. The chief crossed the packed dirt floor in the 2 long strides and knelt beside the bunk. The boy, Toba, stirred at the proximity, his eyes fluttering open. A weak, fearful sound escaped his cracked lips. Nantan spoke. His voice was not the sharp command of a warrior Eli had expected. It was a low, urgent, and incredibly soft rush of Apache. It was the sound of a grandfather, deep and resonant, soothing a child lost in the haze of fever. He gently laid one large, calloused hand on the boy's forehead, brushing back the matted, sweaty hair. Outside, in the bright, invasive light of the new morning, the woman, Raya, held her ground. She had not moved from the spot where she dismounted. She stood like an anchor point for the 300 silent warriors, and her gaze pinned Eli to the porch. She took 2 steps closer, stopping just outside of arm's reach. Her voice was low, tense, and laced with an accent that blurred the edges of the words. She spoke a mix of halting English and Spanish, the common trade languages of the borderlands. "You," she said. Her voice was sharp. She pointed a finger at Eli. A clear accusation. Why he here? Eli's throat felt like it was full of hot gravel. He tried to speak, to form a word, but only a dry, clicking sound came from his throat. Raya's dark eyes narrowed instantly. Her hand drifted, not toward a rifle, but to the haft of a long knife sheathed at her belt. "You hurt him," she pressed. "You steal him." Her suspicion was a palpable thing, a physical shield she held up against him. It was not simple malice. It was the hard-earned, bitter suspicion of a people who had learned, time and time again, that a white man's presence near one of their own meant only theft, violence, or death. Her face was a mask of those broken promises, of ambushes disguised as parleys, of years of casual, cruel betrayals. "Why he in your house?" Eli shook his head frantically, a movement that sent a spike of pain through his dehydrated skull. He raised his empty hands, palms facing her, trying to show he was not a threat. "No," he rasped. The sound was terrible, like dry leaves scraping across stone. "No, he swallowed, tasting only dust and the metallic tang of fear. "Water," he croaked, the word barely a whisper. He had no strength, no voice. He had to show her. He pointed, his hand shaking, toward the distant, shimmering line of the arroyo, miles away. "Found him," he stammered. "In the wash. Hurt." He mimed, staggering and then collapsing, his hand hitting the sand-caked floor of the desert. He pointed to the empty canteen that was still swinging at his hip. He lifted it, his fingers clumsy and stiff as he fumbled with the chain, and he held it out to her. He tipped it upside down. Nothing, not a single drop. Then he pointed to his own mouth. He mimed tilting the canteen, pouring the last of his water. "My water," he forced out. "Gave him my water." He pointed to the long, bloody tear in his own shirt, then gestured through the doorway to the identical, blood-soaked strip of cloth wrapped around the boy's leg. "My shirt, finally." He mimed the agonizing, back-breaking act of lifting a heavy weight over his shoulders, grunting with the memory of the effort. He pointed from the direction of the distant arroyo back to the shack. "Carried him, carried him, here." His voice cracked, not just from the profound thirst, but from the raw, desperate nerves of a man trying to explain a miracle to a jury that was ready to hang him. He was finished. He had no more words, no more proof. He just stood there, swaying on his feet, waiting for the judgment. Inside the shack, the chief's low, murmuring voice had quieted the boy's fevered tossing. Toba's eyes, though still clouded with pain and confusion, found his grandfather. He began to speak, His voice was thin as a spider's silk, broken by weak coughs. But he spoke with urgent, breathless bursts of energy. He gestured, his small hand trembling. He pointed to his own wounded leg. He mimed a long, terrible fall from a height. He mimed the sensation of the burning sun, his hand clawing weakly at his own throat to show the desperate thirst, the blackness. Then his gesture changed. He pointed, his finger trembling, toward the doorway where Eli stood silhouetted against the blinding dawn. He mimed his own collapse, the moment of giving up. And then his fingers touched his own split lips, a look of wonder coming over his face as he mimed the feel of water, the impossible sweetness of it. He mimed the feeling of being lifted, of being carried on a strong back. Nantan listened. He did not move a muscle. He was a statue of perfect concentration, absorbing every weak word, every fumbling gesture from his grandson. As Toba spoke, the chief's weathered face, which had been a mask of cold, implacable fury, began to shift. The rage did not disappear. Eli could still see it, like a hot coal banked deep behind his eyes. But it settled, sinking beneath the surface, replaced by something quieter, heavier, something much harder to name. It was the look of a man recalculating the entire world. Nantan placed his hand on Toba's chest, a silent command to rest. He stood, his headdress once again brushing the low roof beams, and turned. He stepped back out onto the porch, emerging from the darkness into the full light. Eli flinched. Rhea tensed, her hand still on her knife. The chief ignored them both, his eyes fixed on the empty canteen still swinging from Eli's belt. He reached out, his hand open, palm up. It was not a request. Eli, trembling from exhaustion and fear, unhooked the canteen and placed it in Nantan's waiting hand. Nantan held it. He weighed it in his calloused palm, feeling its absolute, definitive emptiness. He lifted it, sniffing the mouth of the canteen, smelling the alkali dust and the faint, metallic tang of Eli's own saliva. He turned it over, inspecting the dry, cracked cork. He looked from the hollow piece of tin to Eli's own split, dusty lips and sunken, haunted eyes. Nantan understood the math of the desert. He understood thirst. He understood what this hollow, hot canteen represented. With a deliberate, final motion, he did not hand it back. He simply dropped it. The canteen fell, its chain catching on Eli's belt, where it swung back and forth, thudding softly against his hip. It was a hollow pendulum, marking the passage of a verdict. It was an unspoken, unambiguous acknowledgement of the sacrifice. Nantan turned from Eli and knelt on the hard pan. He smoothed a patch of dust with the side of his hand. The 300 warriors watched in absolute silence. Rhea watched. Eli watched. With one finger, Nantan drew a large cluster of interlocking circles. "Our people," Rhea translated softly. Her voice was still wary, but the sharp, deadly edge of her suspicion had been blunted. Next to the cluster, he drew one small, solitary circle, far apart from the others. "Toba." Then he drew a crude stick figure, tall and thin, standing alone. "You." Nantan paused, his finger hovering over the dirt. Then he drew a single, deep, undeniable line in the dust, connecting the stick figure of Eli to the lost, lone circle of Toba. He tapped the line, his finger leaving a small indentation. Rhea watched him, translating not just the drawing, but the concept. "He was lost," she said, her English finding more certainty. "He was outside, dying. You chose to see him." Eli stared at the drawing. It was so simple. A man finding a boy. A line. But it felt heavy, like a brand. His dry, aching mind flickered. He thought of Clearwater, the small, dusty settlement 10 miles down the wash. He thought of the saloon, of the men hunched over warm whiskey, their talk always circling back to the Apache threat. He heard their voices, loud and ignorant, spinning tales of hostile bands and savages who needed to be wiped out. Rumors that men like Judah Pike fanned with casual cruelty and for his own profit. Eli suddenly had a vivid, terrifying image of what those men in the saloon would say if they saw him now, standing here, not just with Apaches, but surrounded by 300 warriors, breathing the same air as their chief. They would not see mercy, they would see a traitor. Nantan was not finished. He drew another line. This one started at the large cluster of circles, his people, and connected them to a crude, square shape he drew next to Eli's stick figure, the shape of a house, Eli's shack. Nantan tapped the line connecting his people to the shack twice. Then, he reached out his finger and tapped Eli's chest, hard, right over his heart. Eli looked at Rhea, his face a mask of confusion. Rhea struggled for the right word. She looked at the line in the dirt, at Eli, at the chief. She settled on the only one that fit the weight of the gesture. Bound, she said. You and us. We are bound. As she spoke, the sun finally broke free of the horizon. The first true slant of sunlight poured over the rim of the desert, washing the entire tense scene in a sudden, dramatic gold. It lit the impassive faces of the 300 riders, turning them into bronze statues. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. It struck Eli full in the face, and in that moment of blinding, painful clarity, he understood. He had knelt in the arroyo yesterday as Eli Mercer, a broke cowboy, a man with nothing, a ghost waiting to die. He had given away his last 2 sips of water. But the desert did not trade in small gestures. He understood that he had just stepped into something far bigger, older, and more dangerous than one boy dying in the sand. His hunger, his thirst, his profound and aching loneliness, they were all still there, screaming in his body. But they had been shoved aside, replaced by a new, heavier, and far more terrifying burden responsibility. The line in the dirt was a chain. He was bound. The desert does not keep secrets for long. News, like water, finds a way to flow, even in the driest territory. It traveled first as a rumor, carried by a lone prospector who had seen the impossible gathering from a high ridge. He had half run, half crawled his way into Clearwater, his eyes wide with terror, babbling about a war party. Within an hour, that rumor found its way to the ears of the one man in the valley who knew how to turn fear into profit. Judah Pike was sitting in his usual chair at the Red Dog Saloon, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. He was a broad, thick man, dressed not in cowboy denim but in a tailored wool suit, an absurdity in the Arizona heat that he wore as a testament to his separation from the land he was conquering. He had a face like a closed fist, and eyes the color of a cold, gray sky. He had been the one to burn Eli Mercer's herd, the one who had bought up half the valley for pennies on the dollar when the drought and his own tactics had starved the small ranchers out. He listened to the prospector's frantic story, his expression unmoving. 300 Apaches, at Red Willow Wash, at Eli Mercer's collapsing shack. Pike took a slow sip of his whiskey. He did not see a threat. He saw an opportunity. He stood, his chair scraping loudly across the floorboards, silencing the saloon's low murmur. He placed a silver dollar on the bar. "Give these men a round. Sam," he said, his voice a low, confident rumble. "It seems we have a problem." He began to move through the room, not as a citizen, but as a general inspecting his troops. He was fanning the settlers' fear like a man stoking coals. 300 warriors, he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. He let the number hang in the smoky air. "Not a hunting party. A war party? Camped right on our doorstep?" A nervous ranch hand at a corner table stopped cleaning his fingernails with his knife. "Mercer," the hand said, his voice thin. "They're with Eli Mercer." Pike smiled, a cold, thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "Mercer," he repeated, tasting the name with contempt. "A broke, bitter man. A man with nothing to lose. Who's to say he didn't invite them? Who's to say he hasn't turned?" He moved to the center of the room, his voice dropping into a tone of false, shared concern. "Friends, neighbors, I've been telling you for a year that the high country was growing restless. I've warned you that weakness invites aggression." He let his gaze sweep over the anxious faces. "Think of your families. Think of your stock. We all remember what happened to the settlers up on the San Pedro. Butchered families. Women and children. A low, angry murmur rose from the men. Pike had them. "This," Pike said, his voice rising, "is why we need strong leadership, not some timid lawman hiding behind a badge. We need men of action. We need to ride out there and show them that Clearwater is not a target. We need to keep this town safe." He walked to the back of the saloon, where Sheriff Collier was quietly nursing a lukewarm beer, trying to make himself small. Collier was a weary man in his late 50s, a man who had seen too much and done too little. His spine, once straight, now seemed to have a permanent bend, as if he were perpetually bracing for a blow. Pike clapped a heavy hand on the sheriff's shoulder, a gesture that was both friendly and a threat. "Sheriff," Pike said, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper, "this is your moment." Collier winced, not looking up from his glass. "Now, Judah, we don't know what they're doing there. 300, that's Army business. That's not for a town posse. The Army is 50 miles away in Tucson," Pike sneered, his voice low and sharp. "By the time they get here, our throats will be cut. We need to act. We need to organize a posse and get that broke cuss Mercer to tell us what they're planning." Pike leaned in closer. "Think of it, Collier, the man who faced down 300 Apaches, the man who saved Clearwater. The election is in 6 months. I have a lot of friends, a lot of pull. I could make sure everyone remembers who the hero was." He paused, letting the bribe settle. "And I'd be willing to put up a substantial bounty for information, for the capture of any traitors." Collier finally looked up, his eyes full of a misery that Pike mistook for consideration. The sheriff knew. He knew Pike had burned Mercer out. He knew Pike was a land shark, but he also knew he was weak, and Pike was not. I'll think on it. Judah." Collier stammered. "You do that," Pike said, straightening up. "But don't think too long." While fear was being forged into a weapon in Clearwater, something entirely different was happening at Red Willow Wash. Eli, his body screaming from a thirst so profound it felt like his blood had turned to grit, had been given water. Nantan had signaled, and a warrior had brought a skin. The water was warm and tasted of pine pitch, but it was the sweetest thing Eli had ever known. He drank until he nearly choked, the strength slowly seeping back into his limbs. Then the work began. Nantan gave a series of low commands. Instantly, the silent, watching army transformed. They were not a war party. They were a work crew. Warriors dismounted and began unloading bundles from their pack horses. There was food strings of dried, cured meat, bags of piñon nuts, smoked fish. There were water skins, dozens of them, which they carried into the shack. There were tools, axes, hide scrapers, bundles of sinew, a team of men, moving with an economy of motion that amazed Eli, climbed onto his collapsing roof. They began tearing off the rotted shingles, tossing the sun-cracked boards to the ground. Others began patching the holes in his walls, not with boards, but with a mixture of mud and grass that they worked with skilled, calloused hands. A third group, led by an older warrior, began pacing out a large square of ground near the small, dry wash. They were building a corral. On ground that had been dead and useless the day before, a structure was rising. Eli just stood there, stunned, holding a strip of jerky in his hand, watching his entire world being rebuilt by the very men he had been taught to fear. Raya stood beside him, her arms crossed. She had been translating the whirlwind of activity. "Toba is the chief's grandson," she explained, her voice now level, the suspicion replaced by a formal, watchful distance. "He is the son of his daughter, who is gone. He is important." She looked at the men working on the roof. "Apache law is simple. A life for a life. A debt must be paid in full. You saved the blood of the chief. This," she gestured to the repairs, "the food. This is the beginning of the payment." Eli looked at the new, strong posts being set for the corral. This is too much. I gave him some water." Rhea turned to look at him, her dark eyes sharp. You gave him your last water. You carried him here. You tore your shirt for his wound. You did this when you were dying yourself. Nantan knows what that means. We all do. She paused, then said, This bond, it is not just a gift. It means protection. Nantan has bound you to us. No one will harm this house. She looked at him hard. But it also means expectations. You are part of us now. In this, you are no longer alone. Eli felt a cold spike of fear that had nothing to do with the Apaches. Part of you. Yes, she said, as if it were obvious. We are here, now. You are here with us. The white eyes will see this. She saw the look on his face, the old, familiar bitterness that he had lived with for a year. You have enemies, she stated. It was not a question. Eli, his throat finally working, found his voice. He told her his own story. He told her about Judah Pike. He told her about his small herd, built up over 5 years of back-breaking work. He told her about the water rights to the small spring on his land, the one Pike had demanded. He told her about the night Pike's men came, the smell of kerosene, the sound of his cattle screaming. He burned me out, Eli said, his voice low and raw. The railroad. They built their line 10 miles south, on Pike's land. He crushed me. He left me here to starve. This hunger, it has been my only steady companion for a year. Raya listened, her expression unmoving, but as he spoke, Eli saw something in her eyes change. The formal distance softened. The guarded look of an interpreter was replaced by the wary understanding of a fellow survivor. She had seen this before. She knew what greed looked like. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. This Pike, she said, he is a man who builds his house on the bones of other men. She looked at the horizon, toward Clearwater. Then you must know, this bond, this help, it is a danger. White fear is a dangerous thing. It is a fire. This man, Pike, he will use these 300 warriors as an excuse. He will tell the others that we are here for war. He will use us to grab the very land he accuses us of trying to steal. Eli knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was absolutely right. Miles away, in the late afternoon, Judah Pike put his plan into motion. He sent 4 of his most trusted hired guns, men who had ridden with him for years, to intercept a small supply wagon heading for a remote mining camp. They wore no masks, but in their saddlebags, they carried pots of paint and a half-dozen broken arrow shafts Pike had bought from a drunken scout. The ambush was quick and ugly. They rode down on the wagon, shouting. The driver, a young man named Fenton, pulled up, his hands in the air. A woman, his wife, sat beside him, pale with terror. Pike's men dragged them both from the wagon. They smashed open 2 crates of supplies, scattering flour and beans in the dust. They overturned the wagon, sending it crashing onto its side. Then, they painted a few crude symbols, lightning bolts, and handprints on the canvas cover. They scattered the broken arrows on the ground. It was almost perfect. But Pike had given one last order. It needed to be believable. One of the men looked at Pike's foreman, a hard case named Boone. He said, "Make it look real." Boone pulled his pistol. The woman screamed. He did not shoot her. He did not shoot the driver. He aimed carefully and shot the woman through the fleshy part of her left arm. She shrieked, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed, clutching the wound as blood poured through her fingers. "There," Boone grunted, holstering his pistol. "That's real enough." He looked at the terrified, weeping husband. "You tell Sheriff Collier you were attacked by a war party, Apaches. You tell him they wounded your wife. You tell him they were heading toward Red Willow Wash." The 4 riders spurred their horses, leaving the couple in the dust with their overturned wagon and a story that would set the valley on fire. By nightfall, the wagon had limped into Clearwater, the driver shouting, his wife moaning and half-conscious, her arm wrapped in bloody rags. The town exploded. Pike's performance in the saloon had primed the pump. This incident was the spark. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces dark with rage. Judah Pike stood on the saloon porch, his voice booming over the din. I told you, I warned you, they've drawn first blood. Are we going to wait until they are burning our homes? Are we going to wait until this is your wife, your daughter? Sheriff Collier, his face as pale as ash, found himself swept up in a tide he could not control. "A posse," someone shouted. "Get Mercer," shouted another. "He's the one, he's with them." Under the swinging yellow glow of the lanterns, a posse formed. It was a volatile mix. There was Sheriff Collier, his badge pinned to a trembling vest. There were Pike's hired guns, including Boone and his men, their faces set in grim, false righteousness. And there were a dozen scared, angry ranch hands and settlers, men who had been carefully, expertly lied to. They rode out of Clearwater, a dark mass of horses and clicking metal, heading toward Red Willow Wash with the righteous, unthinking fury of the deceived. The Apache scouts were too good. The posse was spotted 5 miles out, a rising plume of angry dust heading straight for the wash. By the time the riders from Clearwater crested the last low ridge overlooking Eli's homestead, the work on the shack had stopped. The rhythmic pounding of hammers and the low murmur of voices had ceased, replaced by a silence that was far heavier. The 300 warriors were no longer laborers. They were a living wall. They sat mounted, fanned out in the same wide, defensive crescent they had arrived in, a bristling line of lances, bows, and rifles, perfectly still, waiting. Eli watched them come. His stomach, full for the first time in months, felt cold and tight. He stood on the porch he had been repairing, his hands, raw from unaccustomed work, hanging useless at his sides. He recognized the men in the lead, Sheriff Collier, his face pale and drawn, looking like a man being forced to his own hanging. Beside him, riding a fine black gelding, was Judah Pike, his posture erect, his expression radiating a grim, righteous satisfaction. And behind them, a volatile mix Pike's core group of hired guns, their faces hard and eager, followed by a dozen or so ranchers from the valley, men Eli had once known, their faces now twisted with fear and anger. "They ride fast," Rhea said. She had materialized at his side, her voice low and tight. "They are full of bad stories. They are full of Pike's whiskey and Pike's lies," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. He wiped his sweaty palms on the thighs of his jeans. "And they are carrying rifles." He knew what he had to do. He looked at the shack, where Toba watched from the doorway, his eyes wide. He looked at Rhea, at the unyielding line of warriors on the ridge. Then he stepped off the porch. He walked forward, away from the safety of the repaired house, away from the protective shadow of the Apache line. He walked out into the wide, open space of the hardpan, placing himself directly between the two forces. He stood alone, a single, broke cowboy, the pivot point for a war. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. The posse pulled up, a ragged, nervous line of horses, their breath pluming in the cooling air. Eli could hear the jingle of their bridles, the creak of saddle leather. He saw several rifles rise, lifted by unsteady hands. The barrels wobbled in his direction. He was close enough to see the white knuckles of a young ranch hand named Sims, a man who had once shared a drink with him. Judah Pike spurred his horse forward a few steps, holding one hand up in a magnanimous gesture of peace. His voice, dripping with a thick, false concern, rolled across the clearing. "Eli Mercer, thank God, you're alive." Eli did not move, did not speak. "We heard you'd been taken. Son," Pike shouted, loud enough for the men behind him to hear every word. "We heard this war party had you hostage. Don't you worry, we're here to pull you out. You just step away from them. Walk toward us, nice and slow. We'll cover you." Eli looked past the performance, straight into Pike's eyes. They were not the eyes of a rescuer. They were cold, gray, and furiously calculating. Pike was not looking at Eli's face. He was measuring the distance to the Apache line. He was working out the angles of a crossfire. Judah Pike was not here to save anyone. He was here to start a fire, and he was using Eli as the kindling. A soft footfall landed on the dirt beside him. Rhea, she had come to stand at his left side, So quietly he had not even heard her approach. She held her longbow in her hand, the grip loose, an arrow nocked but not drawn. Her shoulders were squared, her chin high. She was not just standing with him. She was planting herself as a shield. She was a declaration. She spoke over her shoulder, a low, rapid burst of Apache. Eli did not need to understand the words. He felt the meaning. He is lying. Be ready. On the ridge, Chief Nantan, mounted on his white stallion, lifted one hand, palm facing outward. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. 300 warriors, who had been sitting in stoic, patient stillness, shifted as one. Lances were brought upright, their tips catching the light. Rifles were lifted from saddle scabbards and laid across laps. Bows were raised. 300 men went from a state of rest to a state of coiled, kinetic readiness in a single, silent breath. The very air in the valley seemed to grow thin, humming with the promise of imminent violence. The posse horses felt it. They tossed their heads, their eyes rolling, and sidestepped nervously. The scared ranchers looked from the coiled Apache line to Pike, their righteous anger suddenly evaporating, replaced by a much colder, more personal fear. "I am not a hostage," Eli yelled, his voice cracking but carrying across the distance. He found a strange, desperate strength in Rhea's presence, in the solid, unmoving line of warriors at his back. "I am here by choice," Sheriff Collier, his face ashen, urged his horse forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Mercer, what in God's name is going on? We got a report. A supply wagon attacked, a woman shot. They said it was Apache." "I know nothing about a wagon," Eli shouted back, his voice raw. He pointed, not at the warriors, but back toward the shack. "I found a boy, an Apache boy. He was hurt, dying in the arroyo. I brought him here." As if summoned by the words, Toba limped out of the doorway. He was pale, but the fever had broken. He stood in the open, leaning on the doorframe, his leg wrapped in a clean, white bandage the Apache women had applied. The cloth clearly visible. Sheriff Collier saw him. The lawman's gaze flickered between the armed posse, the 300 silent warriors, and the small, bandaged boy standing in the doorway of the repaired shack. He visibly wavered. This was not the simple picture of a savage war party Pike had painted. This was something else. Pike saw the hesitation, saw his perfect scenario slipping away. He spurred his horse aggressively, his voice losing its false concern, turning to a righteous sneer. "By choice," Pike laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You hear that? Boys, he's with them after all we are done. Looks like Mercer's gone native." The words slithered through the posse, venomous and brutally effective. They curled around the oldest, deepest prejudices, the settler fears that Pike knew so well. Gone native. It was not just an observation. It was an accusation, a sentence. It meant he was a traitor to his own skin. "Any man who stands with savages against his own people is no better than they are," Pike roared, sensing he was regaining the crowd's anger. "He's turned. Boys, he's one of them now. My own kind." Eli took a step forward, his hands, which had been trembling, now balling into tight fists. The adrenaline had burned away the last vestiges of his fear, replacing it with a white-hot, clarifying rage. "Is that what you call it? Pike-like when my own kind rode down on my ranch in the middle of the night, when my own kind shot my herd and burned my barn to the ground?" A shocked, uneasy silence fell over the posse. The ranchers from the valley looked at each other, then at Pike. They had all heard the rumors, but to hear it shouted as an open accusation, in front of 300 Apaches, was something else entirely. "You're a liar," Pike bellowed, his face turning a deep, mottled red. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. "You're a desperate, broke fool, and you're lying to cover for these red-skinned savages." "Am I lying?" Eli shot back, taking another step. "Ask him." Sheriff asked Judah Pike why he offered me pennies for my water rights 1 week before my ranch burned. Ask him how many other small ranchers in this valley have been burned out or scared off so he could buy their land for nothing. "Shut your mouth. Mercer!" Pike snarled. His mask of the concerned citizen was gone. revealing the predator beneath. His hand dropped, his fingers brushing the butt of his pistol. He sensed his grip on the posse slipping fast. The men were looking at him now, not with righteous fury, but with a new, dawning suspicion. The standoff was stretched taut, a wire humming at a frequency too high to hear. Ready to snap. It snapped. The young ranch hand, Sims, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting between Pike, Eli, and the line of warriors, saw Pike's hand move toward his gun. He panicked. He flinched, his finger convulsing on the trigger of his Winchester. The rifle boomed, the sound echoing flat and ugly across the valley. The shot was wild, aimed at nothing but the sky. A single, stupid punctuation mark of pure terror. In the same frozen instant of the gunshot, something else happened. Eli heard a sound, a sharp thwack that seemed to come from inside his own ear. A sound like a whip crack. He saw a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a dark streak, impossibly, unnaturally fast. Out in the posse, the rancher Sims screamed, a high, thin sound of shock. His Winchester was torn from his grasp, spinning violently out of his hands to land in the dirt 10 feet away. An arrow, a black-fletched Apache arrow, was vibrating in the wooden stock of the rifle, having struck the metal of the barrel with such percussive, calculated force that it had shattered the man's grip and knocked the gun clean from his hands. Raya stood beside Eli, her bow still held high, her form a perfect, fluid sculpture of lethal grace. She had seen the ranchers flinch, drawn, aimed, and loosed her arrow in the microscopic space of time it took his finger to squeeze. She had not aimed to kill. She had aimed to disarm. Eli had barely seen her move. The shock of it, the speed, the impossible precision shattered the tension. The posse riders stared at the rifles spinning in the dust, then at the woman with the bow, their mouths hanging open. Sheriff Collier came alive. The gunshot, followed by the impossible arrow, had snapped him out of his paralysis. "Stand down!" he roared, his voice finally carrying the full authority of his badge. "Stand down, all of you, that's an order. Put those rifles down." He turned his horse, confronting a stunned and furious Judah Pike. "This is done. Judah, this is not a posse, it's a mob, and I'm not presiding over a massacre. We're pulling back." "We are not," Pike began, his face murderous. "We are," Collier yelled, cutting him off. The sheriff was terrified, but he was more terrified of the 300 arrows that hadn't flown. "This is Army business now. We'll go to Tucson. We'll come back with the Army and a warrant. We'll let them sort this. But we are done here." He wheeled his horse, shouting at the stunned, pale-faced ranchers. "Back to Clearwater now, ride." He did not wait to see if they followed. He spurred his horse and retreated, followed almost immediately by the rattled, confused ranchers, who wanted nothing more than to be away from this place. Pike's hired guns, including his foreman Boone, lingered for a moment, their eyes full of murder, but they were outnumbered 300 to 5. Boone spat in the dust, gave Eli one last, promising glare, and turned his horse. Judah Pike was the last to leave. He sat his horse, staring at Eli across the clearing, his expression a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. He said nothing. His silence was louder and more terrifying than any threat. He yanked his horse's head around and galloped after the retreating posse. A smear of angry dust hung in the air. A curtain falling between Eli's fragile peace and the town's simmering rage, the dust began to settle. The sound of the retreating hooves faded into the distance. On the ridge, Nantan lowered his hand. The 300 warriors relaxed, the coiled springs of their readiness easing, though not one of them sheathed a weapon. Eli stood in the middle of the vast silence, listening to the high, thin whistle of the wind, the strength that had flooded his body, the rage and the adrenaline that had held him upright, drained out of him all at once. His knees threatened to buckle. He felt suddenly, profoundly, exhausted. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, shaking so violently he could not clench them into fists. He felt her step closer. Raya. She had not moved an inch. She was standing nearer to him than she had ever been, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of sage and crushed pine that seemed to cling to her. She did not look at his face. She was studying his trembling hands. She watched them shake, her expression unreadable, her head tilted slightly. Then, her voice, quiet and low, cut through the twilight. "You stood between guns and my people?" She paused, her dark gaze lifting to meet his. "And your people. You stood in the column spacing the middle. Why?" It was a simple question. It was the most complicated question he had ever been asked in his life. Eli looked down at his own shaking hands, then back to her face. He thought of Pike's sneer, of Collier's weakness, of the rancher's blind panic. He thought of the boy in the doorway, and of the arrow that had saved them all. He answered with the only truth he had left. "Because I'm tired," he said, his voice raw and weary from the shouting. "I'm tired of watching men like Pike burn everything they can't steal and call it justice." He met her gaze. He had not said it to impress her, or to justify himself. He had confessed it, as if to himself. Raya held his gaze for a long time. She saw no lie in his eyes. She saw no weakness. She saw a man who had been burned down to his foundations and had, impossibly, found something solid there. A seed of respect, deep and profound, planted itself in her guarded heart. And beside it, something softer, something warmer, and something far more complicated began to take root. The dust of the posse's retreat was replaced by the dust of construction. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by the calendar, but by the rising of new walls and the sinking of deeper roots. The threat from Clearwater and Judah Pike was a low, persistent hum in the distance, a gathering storm. But in the small sanctuary of Red Willow Wash, an impossible community was being forged. Nantan had left a contingent of warriors, a mixed guard of builders, hunters, and sharp-eyed sentries, with Raya in command. The shack, that leaning monument to Eli's failure, was transformed. The Apaches worked with a speed and silent efficiency that humbled him. They reset the foundation, shoring it up with stone. They stripped the rotten planks and replaced the roof with sturdy timber, packed with insulating earth. They built a new room adjacent to the old, not of warped boards, but in the Apache style, a lodge of taut canvas and pine that blended seamlessly with the landscape. The warriors, with a dry, surprising humor that Eli was coming to learn, began calling the place Mercy Ridge. It started as a joke, a teasing reference to the broke white man who had inadvertently acquired a 300-man army. But the name stuck. It was a good name. It was the right name. Eli worked alongside them. He hauled timber until his hands, which had grown soft from a year of starvation and idleness, split, bled, and then hardened into calloused tools. He learned to mix the mud and straw for the walls, feeling the cool earth press against his palms. He was, for the first time since Pike had burned his life to the ground, building something. The hardest work, however, happened in the evenings, after the sun had fallen and the desert air grew a sharp, clean chill. Eli and Raya would sit on the new, solid porch. The campfires of the warriors glowed like a small constellation in the yard. Between them lay a collection of maps Eli had sketched on old pieces of salvaged hide and a tattered ledger book he had once used to count his cattle. They were, quite literally, drawing the map of a shared future. "This waterhole," Eli would say, his finger stained with charcoal, tracing a line. "It goes dry by late August. We cannot graze near it after July." Raya would lean in, her dark hair unbound from its severe braids, brushing his shoulder. The scent of pine smoke and sage seemed to cling to her. "That is our hunting ground," she would counter, her voice low. "Your cattle will scatter the deer." "My cattle," Eli would laugh, a dry, rusty sound he hardly recognized. "I have no cattle. Pike's men saw to that." "You will," she would state, not as a promise, but as a simple fact. "Nantan will see to it. The debt is not paid." Their conversations were practical, essential. They were working out the register marks for grazing. They argued over boundaries. which water sources must be shared, which must be left untouched. He was stubborn, rooted in the settler's concept of lines on a map. She was sharp, logical, and unyielding in her defense of a people who followed the seasons. Not the fences, but beneath the arguments. The ice was melting. The vast, frozen expanse of suspicion that had separated them was cracking. He learned to read the small, almost invisible upturn of her mouth when he made a good point. She, in turn, began to use a dry, teasing wit whenever he became too lost in his own bleak past. "You make a poor rancher," she said one night, after he complained for the 10th time about the rocky soil. "But you are an excellent hauler of heavy rocks. Perhaps that is your calling." He had looked at her, startled by the humor, and found himself smiling. A real smile. It felt strange in his face, like a muscle he had not used in years. The space between them, once a gulf of different worlds, was shrinking. It was becoming a shared space. The threat from Pike, however, was not sleeping. Scouts reported his riders, moving like shadows at the edges of the valley, always watching. One evening, Eli and Raya rode out to check a line of Apache snares. They were scouting a remote, narrow canyon 5 miles north of Mercy Ridge, a place of sheer red rock and deep shadows. An Apache scout had reported that Pike's men had been seen there, and Raya feared they were poisoning the small spring that fed the canyon floor. The sun had already dipped below the western mesa, plunging the canyon into a deep, purple twilight. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the clatter of their horses' hooves on the stone. "I don't like this," Eli said, pulling his horse to a halt. His skin was crawling. "The air feels wrong." "I smell it too," Raya whispered, her hand moving, not to her rifle, but to the quiver on her back. "Tobacco. The cheap kind, and stale whiskey." The world exploded. A gunshot cracked from the rocks high above them, the sound amplified a dozen times by the narrow canyon walls. A puff of dust and rock splinters erupted from the canyon wall, inches from Raya's head. "Pike!" Eli roared. He did not think. He reacted. As a second and third shot rang out from the ridge, he spurred his horse and launched himself sideways, his body colliding with Raya, tackling her clean off her mare. They hit the hard-packed sand in a chaotic, painful tangle of limbs. Eli shielded her with his own body, rolling them both behind a large, sandstone boulder as bullets began to whine and ping off its surface. Dust and sharp rock splinters rained down on them. Their horses, panicked and screaming, bolted back down the canyon, disappearing into the dark. "You are heavy," Raya grunted from beneath him, her voice tight with pain as she shoved at his chest. "Stay down," Eli ordered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled, pulling the rifle he had been given by Nantan from its scabbard, which had miraculously come with them in the fall. "Get your head low," Raya hissed. She had already drawn an arrow, her movement a fluid, predatory reflex. A tense, desperate fight began. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the dying light on the ridge, had them pinned. They were firing steadily, their shots chipping away at the boulder. "They've got us," Eli said, risking a quick look. 4 of them. They'll try to circle. Get an angle." "The one on the left," Raya said, her voice impossibly calm. "He is a bad shot. He is afraid." She peered around the edge of the rock, a tiny, fractional movement. A rifle flashed. She ducked back as the bullets sang past. She moved again, rising just enough, drawing her bowstring to her cheek. She loosed. The sound was a soft, deadly thrum. A high, thin scream echoed down the canyon. It was not a scream of death, but of agony. "My arm! He shot my arm!" a voice yelled from above. "It was a she," Raya whispered, knocking another arrow. "They know where we are," Eli said, his mind racing. He knew this terrain. He saw a narrow game trail, barely a sliver in the rock face, leading up the canyon wall. "They'll send men around. I'm going up. Cover me." "Where are you going, Eli?" He was already moving, scrambling up the trail, using the deepening shadows as his only cover. The men on the ridge were focused on the boulder, sending a steady stream of fire. They did not see him. Raya loosed another arrow, this one aimed at the rock near the lead rider, forcing him to duck. Eli reached a small ledge, 30 yards above and to the left of the ambushers. He had a clear angle. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and aimed not at the men, but at the horse of the man who seemed to be giving orders. He fired. The shot boomed. The horse shrieked, a terrible sound, and went down, tumbling in a cloud of dust and loose rock, sending its rider crashing to the ground. "We're flanked," one of the men yelled in pure, blind panic. "It's just the one, get him." That was Boone, Pike's foreman, but their position was broken. Their confidence was gone. Raya sent a third arrow whining past their heads. A clear warning. The panic became total. "It ain't worth it. Boone, he's not alone down there." "Damn you, Mercer!" Boone's voice, full of murder, cursed into the dark. "This is not over." Eli heard them scrambling for their horses. Within a minute, there was only the sound of hoofbeats, fading fast into the night, and the pained groans of the man who had lost his horse. Silence, heavy and profound, returned to the canyon. Eli slid back down the rock face, his rifle smoking, his hands shaking. They were alone. Their horses were gone. They were miles from home, in the dark. "We camp here," Eli said, his voice unsteady. They found a small alcove, a shallow cave carved by ancient winds. Eli used his flint and steel to start a small, smokeless fire with the dry mesquite they gathered. The flames threw flickering, dancing shadows across the sandstone walls. Only when the fire was lit did he see her. She was sitting with her back to the wall, her eyes closed, her face pale. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with a fear he had not allowed himself to feel during the fight. She did not answer. "The first shot?" she whispered. "Let me see." He moved closer, kneeling in front of her. He saw it now. The bullet had missed, but the spray of rock splinters had not. Her left shoulder, where her tunic was torn, was bleeding from a dozen tiny, shallow cuts. A long, angry graze ran along her collarbone, dark with blood and grit. "It is nothing," she said, wincing as she tried to move her arm. "Don't be stubborn," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He unhooked his canteen, always full, now, and wet a piece of cloth from his pouch. "Hold still." The firelight was warm on her skin. He began to clean the wound. His hands were clumsy. He was a man used to branding cattle and mending fences. Not this. His calloused, scarred fingers brushed against the impossible softness of her skin. He tried to be gentle, dabbing at the blood. He realized his hands were shaking violently, not from the climb, from the terror. The image of that puff of dust, inches from her head, was burned into his mind. His breath hitched in his throat, and he realized she was trembling, too. Raya, who had been a perfect, coiled instrument of death in the fight, was shaking. It was not a shiver from the cold. It was a deep, internal tremor, the delayed shock crashing through her composure. "I have seen that before," she said, her voice a low, tight whisper. She was staring into the fire, not at him. "Men on a ridge, firing down." "The ambush?" Eli asked, his hands pausing. "My cousin, and his wife. We were moving camp. They did not even see the riders. It was over in a minute." Her voice was hollow, stripped of its usual authority. "I was hunting. I came back to the silence." She took a shaky breath, a sound that seemed torn from her. "I have lost people in ambushes like this. I am not afraid to die." She finally turned, her dark, haunted eyes finding his in the firelight. "But tonight, when that shot came, the thought of losing you, it hit me like a blow. It was unexpected." The confession hung in the small, warm space between them. It was more intimate than any touch had ever been. Eli felt his own dark secret rise up, a bile in his throat. He had been holding this guilt for so many years it had become a part of him, as much as his bones. He looked at this woman, who had just admitted her fear for him, and he knew he had no right to her respect, her fear, or her presence. "Raya," he said, his voice thick. He sat back on his heels, the bloody cloth clutched in his hand. When I first came to this territory, 4 years ago, I was broke, even more than now. I took any work I could get. He could not look at her. He looked at his own hands, dark with her blood and the canyon dirt. Pike, Judah Pike. He paid well. He needed riders. He said it was just to scare off some hostiles who had been raiding. He swallowed, the memory sharp as glass. It was winter, a hard winter. We found a winter camp, up near the Verde River. It was not a raiding party. It was old men, women, children. He closed his eyes, but he could still see the flames. Pike's men, they rode in with torches. I sat my horse on the ridge. I watched. I did nothing. I didn't know their names. I didn't know their faces. I only heard their screams. He opened his eyes. I took his money. Rhea, I took Pike's blood money, and I bought the land at Red Willow Wash. The land you just helped me rebuild. The silence in the cave was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Rhea's eyes, which had been soft with her own vulnerability, filled. He saw the flicker of anger, sharp and bright. He saw the cold, deep grief of her people. He saw the fragile trust they had spent weeks building, and he watched it shatter. He braced himself for her to stand up, to spit on him, to leave him to the cold. She did not move. She watched him for a long, terrible moment, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, slowly, she reached out. She did not pull away. She took his scarred, trembling hand, the one that had held the torch money, and she lifted it. She pressed his palm flat against her chest, against the warm, solid thrum of her own heartbeat, right over the graze he had just cleaned. Her heart was beating fast, a strong, steady rhythm against his skin. "The man who sat on that ridge is dead," she said, her voice quiet, but fierce. "He died of thirst in an arroyo. Mercy cannot change the past. Eli, it cannot unscream the voices. It cannot bring back my cousin." She pressed his hand harder against her. "But it can change what kind of man you are now. That man on the ridge, he would not have saved Toba. He would not have stood between my people and his own. He would not have confessed this to me." The fear of death was still clinging to them, a cold shadow in the warm cave, the weight of their shared confessions. His guilt and her grief had bared them both. The air was charged, stripped of all pretense, under the vast, cold spill of stars, visible through the mouth of the alcove. They were just two people, survivors, marked by the same land and the same enemy. Eli looked from his hand, still pressed to her heart, to her face. Her lips were slightly parted. Her eyes were dark, searching his. He did not know who moved first. It did not matter. He leaned in, his movement hesitant, almost a question. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was hesitant for a single, breathless second. And then it was fierce. It was all the unsaid words of the past weeks, all the arguments over maps, all the shared glances. It was the terror of the ambush, the adrenaline, the sudden, sharp understanding of how close they had come to losing this thing they had not even named. It was the taste of dust and salt and the faint, lingering copper of her wound. His other hand, the one that had been cleaning her shoulder, slid up. His calloused, trembling fingers traced the strong line of her jaw, moving into the softness of her hair, his thumb brushing her cheek. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, came up. Her fingers curled into the rough cotton of his shirt, gripping him, pulling him closer, anchoring him. They broke apart, but only slightly, their foreheads resting together. He could feel her breath, warm and quick, against his mouth. She let out a small, shaky laugh, a sound of pure, astonished relief. He found himself laughing too, a low, breathy sound. The tension of the fight, of the confessions, broke, leaving them weak and raw. The firelight danced across her face. He saw the strength there, and the vulnerability. They moved closer, bodies aligning in the small, warm space. There was no plan, no script. There was only the profound, animal need to be close, to affirm life in the face of death. His hand moved from her jaw, down the column of her throat, his fingers tracing the edge of the graze he had cleaned, a touch that was both a comfort and a promise. Her fingers uncurled from his shirt, her palm sliding up his chest, feeling the heavy, frantic beat of his heart. The narrative lingered on their embrace. It focused on the warmth of their shared breathing, the press of his forehead against hers, the safety they found in the solid, living presence of each other. The camera of the mind pulled back, leaving the small fire to throw its flickering, golden light onto the sandstone walls. It faded, gently, to the silhouettes of two figures, lying side by side, their forms distinct and then merging in the growing shadows. As the fire burned low, and the canyon held its breath, the first light of dawn was not soft. It was a harsh, gray blade that sliced into the shadows of the alcove, bringing with it the cold, sharp reality of the world outside, the warmth of the night, the impossible, fragile safety they had found in each other, evaporated in the chill. They did not speak of it. They dressed, checked their weapons, and found the tracks of their horses, which had, by some miracle, not run far. They mounted, Eli wincing as his bruised muscles protested, Raya settling into her saddle as if she had been born there, her face already a mask of command. They rode hard, not as companions, but as soldiers. The ride back to Mercy Ridge was a pounding, desperate race against the sun. Every beat of the horses' hooves a drumbeat of approaching war. They both knew, without saying it, that Judah Pike would not rest after a failed ambush. He would not accept a defeat by a broke cowboy and an Apache woman. He would escalate. As they crested the last ridge overlooking the valley, Rhea pulled her mare to a sudden, sliding halt. She did not point. She did not have to. "There," she said, her voice flat, all the softness of the night gone. Eli looked. It was not the small, angry plume of dust the posse had kicked up. This was different. On the far eastern horizon, a long, disciplined column of dust was rising, moving with a slow, measured, and unstoppable purpose. It was not the erratic cloud of a rabble. It was the organized, churning signature of a military force. "That's not Pike's men," Eli said, his stomach turning to ice. "The color. It's blue. That's the army." They kicked their horses into a reckless gallop, down the slope and toward the homestead, the knowledge of what was coming chasing them like a physical thing. Pike had not just run back to Clearwater. He had brought the full weight of the United States government down upon them. In a dusty, makeshift office in Clearwater, Judah Pike was pouring Captain Rowan another whiskey. Rowan was a man in his late 30s, with a ramrod straight back and a hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with whiskey. He was ambitious, posted to this forgotten territory, and he was desperate for a commendation, a citation, anything to lift him out of this sun-scorched purgatory. "It's a clear-cut case of insurrection, Captain," Pike said, his voice a low, reasonable thrum. He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. "Here's the sworn testimony from the driver of that supply wagon. Fired upon without provocation. His wife shot. He identified them clearly. Apaches, led by a white trader. Mercer?" Rowan read the report, his lips a thin, tight line. "And this, Mercy Ridge, a fortress." Pike lied smoothly, gesturing to a crude, forged map. "That's my own intelligence. He's gathered warriors from the high country. They're massing for a full-scale war. They're planning to burn Clearwater to the ground, just as a start. They're sitting on the only reliable water source in this valley. And they mean to hold it. 300 warriors," Rowan said, the number tasting like opportunity on his tongue. "It's a substantial force, which is why Sheriff Collier's posse was forced to retreat. They were outgunned. This is not a police action, Captain. This is a military one." Pike leaned in, his voice dropping. "Pacify this threat, Captain." "Secure this valley, and you'll be the man who saved the Arizona Territory from another bloody war. The reports to your superiors. I have friends. They will be glowing." Rowan looked at the map, He saw a clear objective. He saw a defined enemy. He saw a path to promotion. And, Pike added, playing his final card, "My scouts report they're digging in. They have repeating rifles." Rowan stood, his decision made. "Mr. Pike, my men are at your disposal. We will march at dawn. We will bring the cannon." Rowan was not a butcher like Pike. He was simply a man who saw his future, and he was willing to walk over graves to get to it, as long as the paperwork was in order. He led a column of blue-coated soldiers out of Clearwater, a heavy artillery piece rumbling behind them, intending to pacify the threat and, incidentally, secure the grazing rights that Pike planned to control on paper before the smoke had even cleared. Back at Mercy Ridge, the news of the approaching column hit the camp like a physical blow. Nantan convened his war council immediately. The warriors gathered in a large, tense circle in the yard Eli had helped build. Smoke from the cooking fires twisted into the sky, the mood of industry and hope replaced by a grim, metallic fear. Toba sat at his grandfather's side, his face pale, watching the men who had become his saviors. A young warrior, his face painted with 2 lines of black, spoke first, his voice hot with anger. "We fight. We know these canyons. They do not. We can bleed this bluecoat column dry before they ever see the walls of this house. We can make them pay for every step they take on our land." A low murmur of agreement ran through the younger men. Then, an older warrior, his face a map of old scars and older wisdom, stood up. He did not speak with fire. He spoke with a cold, weary logic. "You have not fought the soldiers as I have. We can kill them, yes, but they have the gun that shoots thunder." He gestured toward the valley. "The cannon. It will turn these new walls to dust from a mile away. They have the new rifles that fire 10 times without rest. We cannot fight a stand-up battle against their machines. We will die. Our families will die. And for what? A pile of dust." The council was split. Fury against fear. Open battle was suicide. To run was to surrender the valley to Pike forever. Into this deadlock, Eli stepped forward. He stood in the center of the circle, his hands open. He was no longer the broke cowboy. He was the man of Mercy Ridge. "He is right," Eli said, his voice clear and steady, nodding to the old warrior. "You cannot win this fight, not the way they want to fight it." Raya moved to stand beside him, a silent, unshakable show of support. "But this is not a war for land," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a war about a lie, Pike's lie. If we kill these soldiers, the lie wins. They will send 1,000 more to avenge them. We do not need to defeat the army. We need to defeat Pike." Eli picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. "I know these men. I know how a man like Captain Rowan thinks. He is not here for blood. He is here for glory. He is here because Pike has painted him a picture of a savage war, and he believes he is the hero who will stop it." Eli looked around the circle, his eyes meeting theirs. "So, we must show him he is not the hero. We must show him he is the fool." "How?" the young warrior demanded. "We set a trap," Eli said. "Not with arrows, but with the truth. We let them approach. We let them see you." He pointed to the surrounding ridges. "All of you, 300 warriors, visible on the hills. Not attacking, not threatening, just watching. Let him see your strength. Let him be nervous." He took a deep breath. "And then, I will walk out, alone, with a white flag." A wave of dissent rippled through the warriors. "They will shoot you down. A lone white man, carrying a truce flag, they will hesitate." Eli countered. "It is against their own rules of war, and I will not go empty-handed. I will carry the proof." He looked at Rhea. "Your scouts, the staged wagon raid? Where did they find the goods Pike's men stole?" "In a box canyon, half a day's ride from here," Rhea said, her eyes gleaming as she understood. "Hidden where only Pike's own men would know to look. We recovered the crates." "I will take that evidence," Eli said, the word dripping with scorn. "I will walk out there, and I will force Captain Rowan to face the man who lied to him. We will spring Pike's own trap back on him, in front of the entire United States Army." The plan was audacious. It was desperate. It was, they all knew, the only way. An hour later, the camp was a flurry of silent, purposeful movement. Warriors fanned out, taking their positions on the high ridges, a silent, watching crescent of 300, just as Eli had asked. Eli stood on the new porch, his hands wrapped around the pole of the white flag, a piece of cloth ripped from a flour sack. He checked the thongs on the small bundle at his feet, a crate lid marked with the name of the mining company from the attacked wagon. His hands were shaking. He felt her approach. Raya. She came to him, not as a commander, but as the woman from the canyon. Her face was a mask of perfect warrior calm, but he saw her fingers tremble as she reached up. She was not touching his face or his hand. She held a small, dark object, a smooth river stone, polished by time, tied to a leather thong. "From my people," she whispered, her voice for him alone. For protection. She lifted her hands, her fingers brushing the skin of his neck as she tied the thong. The simple, light touch was more grounding than a suit of armor. He stood perfectly still, her small, trembling movements a stark contrast to the iron control in her eyes. She tied the knot, her hands lingering for a second at his collar. They stood close, the world shrinking to the few inches of space between them. They looked out at the valley. The dust column was no longer a distant smudge. It was a serpent of blue and brown, coiling at the base of their ridge. "It's a possible future," Eli said, his voice quiet, his hand instinctively touching the stone at his neck. "What you said, Mercy Ridge, a place for both, children who speak both languages, fewer graves." "It is," she said, her voice just as low. "If we can earn it this day." He let out a long, ragged breath, the mask of the brave planner falling away. "I'm scared. Raya." She did not flinch. She did not offer him false comfort. She turned, her dark eyes locking with his. "Good. Not of them," he clarified, gesturing with the flag. "Not of dying. I'm scared of failing. Of getting this wrong. Of one of your men on that ridge losing patience. Of Rowan being too stupid to listen. I'm scared of failing you. And Nantan. And that boy." She laid her forehead against his. It was not a kiss. It was a sharing of the burden, a pressing of her strength into him. Her hair smelled of the sage and pine he now associated with her, with home. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Eli Mercer," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "It is just fear that decides to walk forward anyway. You're walking forward. Whatever happens now, the act of mercy that started this, the act that brought 300 warriors to your door, it will not have been in vain." He closed his eyes, for one brief second, drawing in her scent, her strength, the solid, living reality of her. A single sharp bugle call shattered the morning, high, brassy, and arrogant. They pulled apart. The moment was over. "They are here," Raya said. Her face was stone. "My sharpshooters are in the rocks. They know the plan. They will not shoot to kill. They will not miss." Eli nodded. His own face settled into a mask of grim, pale resolve. He picked up the white flag and the bundle of evidence. He stepped off the porch and began his long, lonely walk down the slope to meet the army. The valley floor was no longer a home. It was a theater of war. At the base of Mercy Ridge, the column of blue-coated soldiers fanned out into a long, disciplined battle line. Their movements were sharp, drilled, and impersonal. Behind them, the wheels of the cannon were dug into the earth, its single and dark eye aimed directly at the heart of the homestead. To their right, a more ragged line formed. Judah Pike and his hired riders, including the foreman Boone, sat their horses, a venomous cluster of men, their rifles already resting in their hands. The dust swirled around them, gritty and yellow in the morning light, and on the heights, the response. 300 Apache warriors sat motionless on horseback. They lined the ridges in a vast, silent crescent, a living wall of eyes and steel. They were not a charging horde. They were a statement of presence. They held their lances and bows upright, a forest of weapons against the sky. They were not hiding, and they were not running. They were waiting. Into this terrible, geometric silence, Eli Mercer walked. He moved out from the porch, alone, into the killing ground between the two forces. His hands were raised, palms open and empty, to show he held no weapon. In his right hand, he held the flimsy white flag, the cloth flapping weakly in the dry wind. In his left, he carried the bundle of evidence. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on his back and the weight of 100 guns on his chest. The small, carved bone token Nantan had given him that morning rested against his chest, a heavy, tangible reminder of the bond he was trying to save. He kept walking, his boots crunching on the hardpan, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. He stopped, 100 yards from the army line. A single, small, unarmed man. Judah Pike's voice cut the air, sharp with false urgency. "Captain Rowan, look, he's been captured. They're using him as a shield." Eli saw Pike turn to the captain, his face a mask of performative concern. "That's their way. They'll send him out to talk, and then they'll rush the hill. You have to fire now. Open up with the cannon before they slaughter us all." Captain Rowan did not give the order. He sat his horse, his field glasses trained on Eli. He saw a lone man, not a hostage. He saw a man walking with purpose, not a man being pushed. He looked from Eli to the silent, immobile line of warriors on the ridge. They were not charging. They were watching. Rowan lowered his glasses, a bead of sweat tracing a line from his temple down his tight jaw. He weighed the glory of a preemptive strike against the cold, uneasy feeling that he was being pushed too fast, by a man who was too eager. Eli planted the white flag in the dirt. He let his hands fall to his sides. He took a deep, steadying breath, and he spoke. His voice, clear and strong, carried across the valley. "Captain Rowan, my name is Eli Mercer. I am not a hostage. I am here by choice." Rowan sat impassive. Pike snarled. "He's a traitor, don't listen to him." "I am the owner of this land," Eli shouted, his voice gaining power. "And I am here to tell you that you have been lied to." He spoke clearly, the words rolling out over the armed men. He told them the story. He told them about finding a boy, an Apache boy, dying in a dry arroyo. He told them about giving him his last sips of water. He told them about the day 300 warriors had arrived at his door. Not for war, but for gratitude. "Look at this house. Captain," Eli yelled, pointing back at the homestead. "Does this look like a fortress? This is a home that was falling apart. These men, these Apache warriors, they have spent the last weeks rebuilding it. They brought their own food, their own tools. Mercy Ridge was built with shared work, not with blood." "He's lying," Pike roared, his voice cracking with rage. "I am not." Eli turned, his gaze fixing on Pike, and he pointed, his entire arm trembling with the force of the accusation. "He is the liar, Judah Pike. He is the one who wants a war. He is the one who has been terrorizing this valley, not the Apache." Eli took a step toward Pike's line. "You want to know about the supply wagon, the woman who was shot? Ask him. Ask him why his men staged that attack to draw you here. Ask him how they got the goods." As he spoke, a signal was given. On the ridge, to the left, 2 Apache riders moved forward. They lifted a large, wooden crate lid, the stenciled name of the Clearwater Mining Company clearly visible in the morning light. "There is your evidence," Captain Eli shouted. "Recovered from a canyon where Pike's men hid it." Another rider moved forward, lifting a distinctive saddle, the one belonging to the driver, Fenton. "He lied to you about the raid." Eli's voice was raw now, a full-throated accusation. "He lied to you about this fort, and he lied to you about the ambush in the canyon when his hired guns, his foreman Boone right there, tried to murder me and the chief's daughter." Judah Pike, cornered, exposed, and humiliated in front of the United States Army, lost his mind. His mask of the calculating cattle baron shattered, revealing the rabid animal beneath. "You are a dead man! Mercer!" he screamed. All pretense of law or concern was gone. There was only pure, murderous rage. Pike's hand clawed for the pistol at his hip. He ripped it from the holster, his arm snapping up, the muzzle aiming straight at Eli's heart. The valley had been holding its breath. Now, It exploded. Crack! The sound was not the boom of Eli's rifle. It was not the heavy report of an army carbine. It was a single, impossibly sharp, flat crack, like a giant's whip striking the air. Pike screamed, a high, strangled sound of pure shock. The pistol, which had been in his hand, aimed at Eli's chest, was simply gone. It flew from his grasp, spinning end over end, to land in the dust 20 feet behind him. Pike's hand was a mangled ruin of blood and numbed, broken fingers. Silence, a stunned, absolute, heart-stopping silence, from a position of rocks high on the ridge, a place no one had been looking. A tiny wisp of white smoke rose into the air. Rhea, a sharpshooter, hidden, a shot that had not aimed to kill, but to shatter, a shot of impossible, terrifying precision. The entire army line shuddered. Young soldiers, their fingers tight on their triggers, looked from their captain to the man whose hand had just been blown apart, to the impossible marksman on the hill. They were half ready to open fire, half reeling from the realization that they were not just outgunned, they were outclassed. Captain Rowan stared at Pike's bloody hand, then at the spinning pistol in the dust. Sweat was running freely down his neck now, soaking the high blue collar of his uniform. He finally, truly, understood. He was standing between a lies and a massacre he would not win. He paid me," a voice stammered. It came from the ranks of Pike's men, a young, freckled teamster. The man who had driven the attacked wagon was sliding off his horse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely stand. It was Fenton. His terror of the Apaches had just been eclipsed by his terror of the woman who had made that shot. "What did you say, soldier?" Rowan's voice was like ice. "He paid me," the teamster cried, stumbling forward, his hands raised. "Mr. Pike, he paid me to keep quiet. He gave me $50. He said just to tell the story, that no one would get hurt. But then his man Boone, he shot my wife. He shot her in the arm, just to make it look real." The teamster was sobbing now, pointing a shaking finger at Boone. The raiders. They weren't Apache. They rode like white men, and they smelled of Pike's own cigars, the same ones he's smoking right now. Every eye in the army line turned. Not to Eli, not to the Apaches, but to Judah Pike. Captain Rowan turned his horse, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. He looked down at the bleeding, sputtering cattle baron. "Mr. Pike," Rowan said, his voice lethally quiet, "do you think the United States Army is your own personal gun barrel? Do you think you can use my men to settle your petty, criminal land disputes?" Pike, clutching his ruined hand, his face pale with shock and pain, finally broke. "Fools!" he shrieked, his voice a ragged mess. "All of you weak men, you forgot which side you are on. They are savages, savages. This land is ours for the taking. If you just have the guts to take it, it's about profit. It's always about profit. You weak, stupid, blue-coated fools." He had exposed himself. His true motive, profit over peace, greed over law, lay bare for everyone to hear. The moment hung on the sharpest knife's edge. The soldiers were confused. Pike's men were trapped. The Apaches were coiled. Into this standoff, a new figure moved. Chief Nantan urged his white stallion forward. He did not charge. He did not rush. He simply rode with deliberate, unhurried grace, out from the line of warriors, down the slope, until he sat his horse beside Eli Mercer, the chief and the broke cowboy, shoulder to shoulder. Nantan looked at the army line, at the sputtering, bleeding Pike, and at the stunned Captain Rowan. Then, Nantan raised his hand, high and open, a signal of absolute command. On the ridges, 300 warriors shifted as one. Lances were lowered, not to charge, but to a horizontal, ready position. Bows were raised, rifles were brought to shoulders. It was not an attack, it was a question. The entire valley held its breath. The fate of every person there, the future of the peace, now rested on the next word spoken. Captain Rowan's face was the color of wet ash. He looked from Nantan's raised hand to the 300 warriors, their weapons a horizontal, glittering line of imminent death. He looked at Pike, who was clutching his bloody, ruined hand, his face a mask of spitting, incoherent rage. He was a career soldier. He understood. In that one terrible instant, the full, catastrophic weight of his position. He had been played. He had brought a U.S. Army cannon to a private land dispute. He was one order away from starting a war he could not win. Based on a lie he had been fool enough to believe. Firing now would not make him a hero. It would write his name into history as a butcher, a fool, or both. His career would be over, buried in a mass grave of his own making. Sergeant Rowan's voice was not a shout. It was a cold, hard, vicious crack. "Arrest that man." The sergeant, his own face pale, blinked. "Sir, you mean—" "I mean Mr. Judah Pike," Rowan roared, his control snapping. "He has committed perjury to an officer of the United States Army. He has incited a military action under false pretenses. He has staged an armed attack on civilian property, resulting in injury. He is a criminal, not a victim. Arrest him now." Pike's head snapped up. "You can't. I am." Two heavily built soldiers dismounted, their carbines leveled. They seized Pike by his good arm, ignoring his howls of pain and protest. They were not gentle. They hauled him from his expensive saddle, his feet dragging in the dirt, and shoved him forward. "On your knees," the sergeant growled, kicking the back of Pike's legs. Judah Pike, the man who had fancied himself the king of the valley, collapsed to his knees in the dust. He was in the center of the theater, forced to kneel in front of the army he had tried to use, the settlers he had lied to, and the 300 Apache warriors he had tried to exterminate. His foreman, Boone, and the other hired guns sat frozen on their horses, their hands slowly, deliberately rising into the air as a dozen blue-coated soldiers swiveled their carbines toward them. The tension did not break. It merely shifted. Nantan dismounted. He handed the reins of his white stallion to a young warrior and walked, his moccasins silent on the hardpan, until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Eli, the chief and the broke cowboy. They faced the kneeling Pike and the watching army as one. Nantan spoke, his voice low and steady, a deep rumble that carried in the silence. Rhea, who had moved from the rocks to stand just behind them, translated. Her voice was clear, ringing with the authority of her chief. "Captain," she said, her eyes on Rowan, "Nantan says that Apache blood remembers every raid. He remembers every broken promise. He remembers the winter camps burned, and the children who did not see the spring." Rowan sat his horse, his expression grim. He nodded, accepting the truth of it. "He says," Rhea continued, "that the law of the desert has long been blood for blood. By that law, this man," she gestured to Pike, "would die. His men would die. And perhaps many of yours. But today, we choose a different kind of revenge." Eli looked at Nantan, a profound, staggering respect filling his chest. Nantan spoke again, a longer, more detailed instruction. Rhea translated, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Pike's kneeling, trembling form. "We do not demand his death. That is a small thing, and quickly over. We demand a sentence that fits the crime. This man's heart is not in his chest. It is in his ledgers. It is in his land. His crime was greed. So, his sentence will be the unwinding of that greed." She pointed, not at Pike, but toward the distant, black smear of his ranch. "Black Spur. That is what he calls his ranch. Nantan demands that it be stripped." Rowan's eyebrows shot up. "Stripped. His livestock, the cattle he built from herds he stole or destroyed, will be released. They will be turned out onto the shared grazing lands of this valley for all families to hunt. His storehouses, which are full while other men starve, will be emptied. The food will be divided between the Apache families he tried to kill and the settler families he tried to starve out. It was a brilliant stroke, a judgment that was not about race, but about economics. It was about justice, not slaughter. Captain Rowan looked at the kneeling teamster, Fenton. He looked at the hard, angry faces of Pike's own hired guns. He looked at Eli. He looked at Nantan. And he made the second correct decision of his day. "Sergeant," Rowan ordered, You will take half the company. You will escort Chief Nantan, Mr. Mercer, and a contingent of their men to the Black Spur Ranch. You will carry out the terms of this sentence to the letter. You will ensure there is no violence, and you will ensure it is done. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." A new kind of procession formed. It was not a war party. It was a column of judgment. A line of blue-coated soldiers, riding side by side with 100 Apache warriors, with Eli and Raya at their head, and Nantan just behind. Pike, his good arm bound, his face gray with pain and humiliation, was forced to ride with them, a prisoner. The rest of the Apache nation remained on the ridge, a silent, unmoving promise, holding the valley in their gaze. They rode to Black Spur. Pike's ranch was a monument to his ambition, a sprawling, newly built ranch house, massive new corrals made from stolen timber, and a bunkhouse that was more like a fortress. When they arrived, Pike's ranch hands, the men he treated little better than slaves, came out, their faces full of fear. But when they saw Pike, bound, his hand a bloody rag, and when they heard the sentence read aloud by Captain Rowan's sergeant, something amazing happened. A cheer went up, a low, hesitant sound at first, then a full-throated roar of approval. These were the men Pike had bullied, underpaid, and threatened. "Open the corrals," the sergeant ordered. Pike's own workers, with whoops of joy, threw open the gates to the massive new corrals. Apache warriors and settlers alike rode in, firing their guns into the air, stampeding the thousands of cattle. Pike's branded wealth out onto the open range. The sound was like thunder, the ground shaking as the beef market of Judah Pike evaporated into the dust. They moved to the storehouses. They were, as Nantan had said, overflowing. Sacks of flour, barrels of whiskey, crates of tinned goods, cured hams. The soldiers stood guard as Apache women, who had followed, and the wives of Pike's own ranch hands, began the work of dividing the spoils, side by side. Then, Eli, Raya, and Nantan walked into Pike's office. It was a shrine to his greed. Ledgers, contracts, deeds, maps. "This," Nantan said, his voice quiet, "is the root of the sickness." "Then we burn it out," Eli said. They carried it all out into the yard, the ledgers detailing his profits, the forged claims, the maps where he had drawn lines across other men's lives. They piled it high at Pike's feet. "This is madness," Pike hissed, his eyes wild. "You cannot. This is civilization." "No," Raya said, her voice cold. "This is a reckoning." They tossed the first torch onto the pile of paper. The dry ledgers caught fire instantly, the record of Pike's empire turning to black, curling ash. Then they turned to the big ranch house, the symbol of his power, built with the blood of men like Eli. It was doused. It was set aflame. This was not a slaughter of men. It was the controlled, necessary, and deeply satisfying execution of greed. Judah Pike was forced to watch as his life's work went up in smoke, as the flames licked the sky. Eli walked over to the bound cattle baron. Pike looked up, his one good eye streaming with tears of pure, impotent rage. He tried one last time. "Mercer," he spat, his voice a low, desperate hiss. You are a businessman." "I see that now. This can be fixed. Name your price. I can make you a rich man. We can cut the army out, cut the savages out." Eli looked down at him. He saw the man who had burned his herd, the man who had shot a woman, the man who had tried to kill him twice, the man who had tried to start a war, all for profit. Eli spat in the dust at Pike's feet. "There is no price. Judah, you cannot buy back my burned herd. You cannot buy back the neighbors you buried. You cannot buy back the screams from that winter camp." Eli knelt, his face inches from Pike's. "But you will give me something. You will sign over any and all claims, real or imagined, to the water rights surrounding Mercy Ridge and all of Red Willow Wash." "I will not," Pike hissed. "Oh, you will," Eli said, his voice soft. "Or I will ask Captain Rowan to leave you here with me, and I will ask Nantan for one last favor. You will sign A soldier brought a piece of paper and a pen. Pike, his hands shaking with hatred, signed his name, the last act of his reign. Raya stepped forward, holding the document up for all to see, for the soldiers and the Apaches. She translated, her voice ringing out over the crackle of the fire. The terms are set, Pike's land is forfeit, the water is shared, under a new pact, written in the white man's English and in the symbols of the Apache people. Eli Mercer is named as mediator and witness to this pact. Nantan stepped forward, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. He looked at the soldiers, at the settlers, at his own people. He spoke, and Raya translated. The two of them a single voice of new law. Nantan declares this Mercy Ridge is our kin. Any attack on that house, or on Eli Mercer, or on his wife, Raya, will be treated as an attack on Nantan's own family. And, he added, his gaze sweeping over his own warriors, any Apache who breaks this new peace, who raids this valley or harms those under this pact, will answer to me first. It was a promise, steel wrapped in respect. It was not a threat. It was a new boundary line, drawn not on a map, but in shared honor. As the sun began to set, painting the smoke from the burning ranch house in shades of blood and gold, the soldiers led Judah Pike away. He was to be taken to the distant territorial court in Tucson to face formal charges. He stopped for one last look at Eli. His face was a mask of ruin. "You think you've won," he muttered, his voice a low, venomous promise. "You have not. Men like me. We always rise. I will be back, and I will burn everything you love." Eli met his gaze. He did not feel fear. He did not feel rage. He felt calm. The long, burning bitterness that had defined his life was gone, burned away with Pike's ledgers. "Then men like us will be waiting," Eli said, his voice quiet. He was no longer just speaking for himself. He was speaking for Raya, for Nantan, for the 300 warriors, and for the scared settlers who had finally seen the truth. It was no longer a personal revenge. It was communal. The soldiers rode off, taking Pike and his hired guns with them. The Apache warriors began to move back toward the high country, their work done, their debt paid in a way that had honored them all. The valley, which had been holding its breath since dawn, finally breathed out. The war was over before the first volley had been fired. The revenge that might have been written in blood and soil had instead been etched into law, into ownership, and into memory. It was not a wound that had been cut off. It was an infection that had been cleansed by fire. The smoke that rose from Red Willow Wash was no longer the black, greasy plume of a burning ranch house. It was a thin, clean, blue-gray spiral, rising from a solid stone chimney into the vast, clean sky. Months had passed. The valley, scarred but not broken, had healed under a new, fragile peace. Mercy Ridge was transformed. The once leaning shack, the symbol of Eli's ruin, was now the solid, steady heart of a true homestead. Attached to it, blending seamlessly as if it had grown there, was an Apache lodge, its canvas and timber walls a testament to a new way of thinking. The two structures, one square and one round, one of wood and one of hide, shared the same foundation and the same chimney. It was a house with two bodies, but one heart. Eli and Raya lived there together. Their partnership had not been sealed by a preacher's paper or a lawman's book. It had been sealed twice, in two different worlds. The first time was by a great fire in the yard, with Nantan presiding. He had blessed them in the Apache way, his hands held over their heads, speaking of the strength of the eagle and the endurance of the stone. The 300 warriors who remained camped in the high ridges, a permanent, watchful presence, had chanted their approval. A deep, resonant sound that vibrated in Eli's chest. The second time was simpler. It was just after sunrise. On the porch they had built together, the air was cold, and their breath plumed in front of them. He had taken her hand, the one not scarred by the ambush, and had spoken the simple, awkward vows of his own people, words he had pulled from a half-forgotten memory of his parents. She, in turn, had looked him in the eye and said, simply, "My path is your path. It is one." It had been sealed with a kiss, not of fire and desperation as in the canyon, but of a deep, quiet, and profound tenderness. Life at Mercy Ridge was a new rhythm, the most jarring and most hopeful. Sound was the laughter of children. Children from Clearwater, whose parents were no longer afraid, now rode out to the homestead. They played with Apache children who had come down from the high camps with their mothers. They chased each other in wild, screaming circles around the new, sturdy corral, arguing, laughing, and trading insults in a cheerful, chaotic mix of English, Spanish, and Apache. Eli would often stop his work, a hammer in his hand or a rein in his fist, and just watch them. He would watch a settler's son with pale hair try to teach an Apache girl how to use a slingshot, only for her to show him, with exasperated patience, how to throw a knife. He would listen to them, amazed that his own broken, silent life had somehow become a bridge for lives that had not even fully begun. The homestead became the true center of the valley. Councils met regularly at Mercy Ridge. They sat in the shade of the new lodge, a circle of men who, 6 months ago, would have only met over the sights of a rifle. Nantan and his chief warriors sat across from ranchers from the valley, the same men who had ridden in Pike's posse, their faces now sheepish and respectful. Even Captain Rowan, his blue uniform stiff and formal, would ride out from Tucson, a cautious but supportive presence. Eli sat at the head of these councils. He was no longer just a broke cowboy. He was the mediator, the witness. He translated, not just the words, but the intent. He would hear a rancher's blunt complaint about grazing and soften the edges, rephrasing it to Nantan as a question of shared resources. And Raya was always at his side. She was his other half, his second set of ears, his second heart. When Eli missed the nuance in a rapid burst of Apache, her hand would rest on his arm, and she would fill in the spaces. When a settler grew too loud or disrespectful, her sharp, clear voice would cut through the tension, reminding them of the pact that had been signed in ash and fire. They functioned as one mind, a single, balanced entity. The days were hard work, rebuilding a herd, digging irrigation for new crops, maintaining the peace. But the quiet, romantic moments of their new life were woven through the routine, all the more precious for their stillness. It was in the evenings. They would stand on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, a warm wrap around her shoulders, and watch the magnificent desert storms roll over the distant mesas. The sound of thunder no longer a threat, but a promise of life. It was late at night, by the fire, when they would talk about fence lines and grazing rights, and he would find himself, without thinking, taking one of her long, dark braids in his hand, his fingers idly, gently rebraiding the silken hair as she spoke. It was in the simple, unthinking touch of her hand on his back as she passed him in the yard. A silent, "I am here," that steadied him. The peace was real, but the world was not perfect. On difficult days, news would ride in of a broken promise from a distant town, or a raid by an outlaw band, white or Apache. On those days, Eli would feel the old ghosts stir, the shadow of the man he had been, the man on the ridge who had watched the winter camp burn. The guilt would rise, the feeling that this new life was something he had not earned. Raya would see it in his eyes. She would not speak. She would simply take his hand, the one that had signed the new pact, and she would press it flat against her chest, against the steady, warm beat of her heart, just as she had in the canyon. It was her constant reminder. This is real. We are real. The man who heard the screams is not the man I am touching. The act of mercy that had brought 300 warriors to his door had also, and more importantly, brought him home to her. One evening, as the air began to take on the first sharp chill of autumn, Nantan came to the homestead. He did not come for a council. He came as a grandfather. He sat with them by their fire, and he ate their food. Toba, his leg now healed into a proud, jagged scar, sat with the other children, his laughter the loudest of all. After the meal, Nantan held his hand out to Eli. In his calloused palm lay a new token. It was not bone. It was a piece of smooth, dark river stone, carved with meticulous care. It was shaped like a small, arched bridge, On one side of the arch, Apache symbols for water and mountain were carved. On the other side, a crude but recognizable carving of a house and a steer. Eli took it. It was heavy and warm from the chief's hand. Nantan looked at him, his dark, ancient eyes full of a wisdom that Eli was only just beginning to understand. He spoke, in the slow, careful English he had been practicing. "You were broke in coin," Nantan said, his voice a low rumble. "When we met, but you were rich. Rich in the only thing that mattered." He tapped his own chest. "You chose mercy. You built the bridge." Eli slid the leather thong over his head. The stone bridge came to rest beside the bone token. The price and the reward, the quiet, healing rhythm of their new life was not destined to last. The world was changing, and the peace they had built was a small, fragile island in a rushing, hungry river. As twilight painted the desert in its final, breathtaking wash of violet and gold, a rider approached, not an Apache scout, not a rancher, a man in a dusty uniform, a telegraph messenger. His horse lathered from a hard ride from Tucson. He carried a telegram. Eli unrolled it, his heart sinking as he saw the letterhead. The Transcontinental Railroad Company. He read it aloud, his voice flat, the words falling like stones into the peaceful evening. The railroad was eyeing the valley. A new survey. A new line. It spoke of tracks running straight through Red Willow Wash. It spoke, in cold, sterile language, of federal domain and necessary relocations. The peace they had built, the one they had earned with truth and fire, was about to face its next, and perhaps its greatest, trial. The greed of one man had been replaced by the greed of a nation. Eli and Raya walked out of the house, the telegram a crinkled piece of poison in his hand. They stood on the low ridge above their home, the home that had become their shared promise, and looked out at the land. The valley was quiet. The lights of the distant settlement of Clearwater, now a place of allies, glowed to the south, and on the high ridges, where they always were, a second, earthly constellation of campfires flickered, the 300 silent guardians, still watching, still present. Eli's hand went to his neck. His fingers found the sharp, familiar edge of the bone token and the smooth, solid arch of the stone bridge. He looked at Rhea. Her face was calm, her gaze fixed on the horizon, already calculating, already planning. She was not afraid. He clasped her hand. Her grip was strong, her fingers lacing with his, together. They turned away from the coming darkness and walked back toward the warm, golden glow of Mercy Ridge, ready to face whatever came next, because a broke cowboy's act of mercy, a gift of 2 sips of water in the dark, had not just saved one boy, it had rewritten the fate of an entire valley, and their love story. It had only just begun. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below, share your thoughts, and let's connect. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider supporting us by hitting that hype button so more people can hear it.